Can you get lead poisoning from your vape gear? So on the Plumes of Hazard episode 175, the topic of potential dangers of brass atomizers came up, and I thought it was a topic worth talking about. There was even a comment on the show from someone who claimed that they actually got lead poisoning from the Nimbus RDA clone a couple of years ago. This clone RDA had a chrome-plated brass deck and posts, and over time, the chrome plating wore off and the e-juice sat on the brass long enough to absorb lead, which was then vaped. He started getting symptoms of lead poisoning and eventually figured out the cause. So if you don't know, cheap brass can sometimes have lead added to it. The acidity of e-juice can cause lead to leach from the brass if it sits long enough. It might not be a problem if your e-juice isn't sitting on it for too long, and it doesn't matter if some parts of your atomizer are brass as long as e-juice isn't touching it. For example, the 510 pin, which is often used because it's more conductive than stainless steel. But who knows what kind of metal a cheap clone atomizer is using? It might be cheap brass mixed with a lot of lead. I've seen some posts online talking about brass on atomizers, and some people say that naval brass is safe because it's a high-strength, corrosion-resistant metal alloy made with copper, tin, and zinc. But if you look at metal manufacturers making naval brass, you'll see that there are still trace amounts of lead, and even more in some other types of naval brass. And this is a really important thing to consider when you buy atomizers, especially when buying clones from China. People buy clones because they're so much cheaper than authentic atomizers, but you have to consider why clones are so cheap. One of the biggest reasons is that the materials are lower quality, and sometimes they just might be made of brass and coated in another type of metal. The Plumes guys mentioned that with the popularity of squonking devices right now, there are clones hitting the market with brass squonking pins connected to the feeding tubes, which obviously would be in constant contact with e-juice. And that's something else to look at on your devices. So is the amount of lead that you would consume from vaping on a brass atomizer cause health issues? It might or might not, but I definitely wouldn't take the risk if I could avoid it. There's no reason to harm your health if you don't need to. I'd say this is a really good reason to stick with only authentic atomizers and avoid clones. I also have a tip for any of you already using brass atomizers and you don't want to stop using them. I just want to say that this is still at your own risk, and I'm not claiming that this is safe and will solve your problems. So this is a tip that beer homebrewers use to clean brass fittings on their brewing equipment. You can use a solution of 2 parts vinegar and 1 part hydrogen peroxide to remove tarnish and surface lead from your atomizers. You let it soak for 5 minutes at room temperature and you should be good. Just be careful about soaking for too long, because that can cause the copper in the brass to dissolve and expose even more lead. And you'll know if you've soaked for too long if the brass turns darker and the cleaning solution turns green. If this happens, start the cleaning process all over again in a new solution.